Hello, I'm Beth Keene, CEO of Holocaust Museum LA. I'm thrilled to welcome all of you to our 5th annual Teicholz Holocaust Remembrance film series. Last year, we held this series virtually and reached over 600 people from around the globe. In the spirit of increasing access to these remarkable films and spreading the important lessons of Holocaust beyond our local community, we are excited to once again offer the Teicholz Holocaust Remembrance film series virtually. This year's series focuses on German Holocaust films, exploring how German cinema has dealt with the complexities of the country's role during the Holocaust. Holocaust Museum LA is the first survivor-founded and Holocaust museum in the United States. We were founded in 1961 by survivors who wanted to create a safe space to display their precious artifacts, to remember their family members who had perished, and to also educate future generations on the important lessons of the Holocaust. Today, the museum continues to provide free Holocaust education to students from across Los Angeles, the United States, and the world, fulfilling the mission of our founders to commemorate, educate, and inspire. I'm especially excited to share that the museum officially reopened its doors to the public last Saturday. The second film in this year's series is the 1999 German production of Aimée and Jaguar. Joining us for today's panel discussion about the film are Jordana Gessler, Jeremy Borison, and Dr. Javier Samper. Jordana Gessler is the Vice President of Education and Exhibits at Holocaust Museum LA. Jordana received a BA from the University of Vermont and an MA in Holocaust Studies from the University of Haifa. She previously worked at Yad Vashem and received the 2014 Yad Vashem Award for Research. She has written articles and presented at conferences internationally on topics including contemporary anti-Semitism, fiction and the Holocaust, art and resistance, and teaching empathy. Jeremy Borison is a director and writer originally from Cleveland, Ohio, now working in Los Angeles. He received his BA from the University of Michigan for film production and directing, where his thesis film, Sense of Sound, screened internationally and was awarded the Arthur Miller Creative Arts Award. His most recent film, Boxes, premiered at the Cleveland International Film Festival and won the Short of the Year Award, as well as the North Carolina Film Award. The film focuses on the intersectionality of Jewish and LGBTQ identities and explores Jeremy's duality as both a religious and filmmaker. Jeremy is currently in development on the feature film Unspoken, which explores the taboo within Jewish communities and Holocaust education around Nazi persecution of gay individuals. Dr. Javier Samper is Assistant Professor of German Studies at Grinnell College. His research focuses on LGBTQ history in Germany. He received a PhD in modern European history from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he was also part of a English program in gender and women's history. He has published articles in the German Studies Review and in the Journal of the History of Sexuality on topics such as Weimar cinema, the queer history of the Holocaust, and youth psychology and adolescent sexuality in the early 20th century. His first book, The Seduction of Youth, Print Culture and Homosexual Rights in the Weimar Republic, was published in 2020 by the University of Toronto Press. Award-winning journalist and best-selling author Tom Teicholz will moderate the discussion. Thank you, Tom, for bringing the idea of a film series to the museum several years ago, and for your enthusiasm and commitment in curating this year's film series, and for lending us your time and insight as moderator today. Thank you also to Zeitgeist Films for the use of this film, and to JQ International for their partnership. I also would like to thank the Consulate General of the Federal Republic of Germany, Los Angeles, for their generous sponsorship of this year's Teicholz Holocaust Remembrance film series, and the generous donors who have supported this series over the years, which include the Davidson Hooker Fund, YNS Nazarian Family Foundation, Rita and Leo Greenland Family Foundation, and the Richenthal Foundation. And lastly, Holocaust Museum LA brings you programs like today's at no charge. If you're enjoying our programs, please consider supporting our work by becoming a member. You can go to holocaustmuseumla.org to learn more. And without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Tom and our panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Beth. Welcome all of you to the second week of the fifth annual Holocaust Remembrance film series, named for my parents who were survivors. I also want to thank our donors who have been with us since the beginning, whom Beth mentioned, and also all the individual donors, all of you who support what we do and who have made contributions and who will continue to make contributions if you like our programming. So I urge you to, if you do like what we're doing, to support this film series, which is, what better place than the Holocaust Museum LA in the capital, world capital of filmmaking, to have a film series of films about the Holocaust. So with that, I just also want to thank our panelists for joining us. Jordana Gessler, who, as you heard, is someone who does the heavy lifting intellectually on this series and often suggests great movies for us to include, and always deepens our conversation. Jeremy, who made this wonderful short boxes, which you can watch on Amazon Prime. You can rent it on Amazon Prime. It's a short film and I highly recommend it. Also, I wanted to mention that IMDb lists Jeremy as additional crew on Captain America, the Winter Soldier. And that's kind of, like, how often do we have a panelist who can say that? And then Javier Samper, whose book, The Seduction of Youth, Print Culture and Homosexual Rights in the Weimar Republic, is about the League of Human Rights, which was Germany's first mass gay and gay rights organization. So a very interesting area of scholarship, which is very much apropos for our discussion tonight about Aimée Jaguar. Now, in 1994, at the age of 80, Lilly Wust told her story to journalist Erica Fischer, which became an international bestseller called Aimée Jaguar, A Love Story, Berlin, 1943. It was translated into 20 languages. Now, interestingly enough, Erica Fischer was herself born in Britain to family of refugees, of Jewish refugees, who then in 1948 all returned to Vienna. And Erica Fischer became a journalist who lived in Berlin and wrote this story with great empathy and sensitivity. In 1999, this became the film which we are going to discuss and which you've watched or are going. It's directed by Max Färberböck with a script by Färberböck and Rona Munro, and it stars Juliane Köhler as Lilly Wust, Aimée, and Maria Schrader as Felice Schragenheim, Jaguar. And here's some interesting trivia. In the movie, Felice's false last name is Schrader, which is probably just a coincidence. But if you wonder what became of Maria Schrader, she was actually a very successful writer-director and was one of the writers and the director of the series Unorthodox, the limited series, which many people have watched recently and loved. And again, just another piece of trivia, she has a daughter named Felice. So that's all just sort of things I came across while researching this. The film opens in 1943 in a Berlin that seems at first hard to believe. While the Allied forces bomb Berlin, we see on screen sort of a gaggle of Jewish women. And it seems at first shocking and hard to believe that they could still be living in Berlin and living these lives where they're, socializing and going to concerts. And we're taken into this world and introduced to these characters, particularly Felice, who seems to be the star around which all these other women have fallen in love. And Felice then seduces, not a mother of four, who is married to a Nazi soldier who's fighting on the Eastern Front. We're taken into this whole world that at first seems hard to believe. So I want to ask Jordana, I wanted to begin to talk about this, the importance of this film in terms of Holocaust education and in terms to broadening our understanding of what went on, particularly for women and for gay women during this time.
Yeah, so I think that there's a lot of educational gain from a film like this. You know, we're talking about the 1990s. I know it's really easy for us today to think about how easy it is to access Holocaust survivor testimony or watch great films about the Holocaust. This simply really wasn't the case in the 1990s. It really wasn't until Schindler's List and the founding of the Shoah Foundation that there became this outpour of survivor testimony gathering and this real opening and conversation around the Holocaust. I mean, there were small moments throughout the decades. In the early 60s, when Eichmann trials happening in Israel, in the 1970s and 80s in the US with the mini-series, The Holocaust with Meryl Streep, but really the 90s is a pivotal moment. It's also really pivotal in our understanding of remembering gay victims of the Holocaust, or the beginning of remembering gay victims. Some of the very first memorials in Germany, even like the first memorial established at the Dachau concentration camp, didn't even include the pink triangle on its memorial of triangles. The penal code that existed in, or that the Nazis used to expand violence against gay men during the Holocaust remained on the books in Germany until the 1990s. So I think it's a really interesting moment that this film comes out because it's based on a true story. It's bringing female voices first. Most early survivor testimony tended to be male-centric. And it's also talking about a victim group that really had not been discussed up until this point. And even though it's not about gay men as victims during the Holocaust, it is introducing this concept of gay victims of the Holocaust and having this conversation. It's also fascinating on a deeper level because it really does explore rescue during the Holocaust. What the film failed to mention, but is actually true, is that Lilly went on to rescue 3 Jewish women after her girlfriend, lover, and I think to them, they considered each other wives because they married in a non-official way. After Felice is taken, she goes on to rescue 3 Jewish women and is actually honored by Yad Vashem as a righteous among the nations. So it's talking about rescue and resistance. It's also talking about this interfaith couples, which is a really interesting conversation within Germany, and understanding how individual people could make an impact, how one person could be transformed and become a courageous hero. And so much of the education work we do at the museum is about taking down barriers, taking down walls between people, between different groups of people. Because if we see each other as human beings and develop empathy towards one another, it will go against hatred. It will go against genocides like the Holocaust. And that's exactly what this film portrays. Here is Lilly, who really doesn't have a concept of Jews. I mean, maybe she kind of has seen Jews being taken away. By 1943, there were maybe about 50,000 Jews living in Germany, all in forced labor. The rest of them were underground with false identities, as is Felice, or had been deported to the East. But Lilly lives in a world of, taking the kids to the zoo and having affairs. And I don't think she's conceptually thinking about German Jews and the plight And here's her relationship with one person that really opens her eyes and leads her to save 3 people. And you can see this a lot in a lot of different stories of rescuers, where humanizing somebody who's a little bit different than you can make a huge change. And I think those are some really important educational topics in this film.
Thank you, Jordana. And I think that one of the things this film does very well is humanize its characters. Javier, I wanted to ask you about sort of what homosexual life was like during the Weimar Republic and under the Nazis. As I understand it, although male same-sex relations were criminalized by the Nazis immediately, they refused to criminalize female same-sex behavior, in part because in the Nazi vision of womanhood and motherhood, women could still produce children and could be even forced to do so through the Lebensborn program. And so they didn't really, despite people wanting them to criminalize female same-sex relationships, they didn't do so. But tell me a little bit about, from your point of view, and how you see the accuracy or not of this representation in this film.
Thank you, Tom, for your question. So I'll get to parts of that in a second. What I would say first about the Weimar Republic is that it is true there was a vibrant gay, lesbian, trans subculture, especially in the city of Berlin at the time, during which homosexuality continued to be criminalized, but the police was not really enforcing many of these laws at the time. And that allowed for sort of this emergence of the subculture and lots of publications and bars and sort of cultural life for queer people at the time. And in 1933, there was a general crackdown. So everything shut down, all the publications disappeared, and people started to live their lives again in secret. But obviously, people continued to have queer lives and queer love during that time. For the case of Felice Schragenheim, she would have been a child during the Weimar Republic, so she didn't really get to experience that life. But certainly she found sort of people, her family of queer people with whom she could sort of feel herself at the time. Maybe what I'll try to do is offer some brief remarks about the historical context. And by doing that, I'll try to underscore why we need a queer history of the Holocaust, which we recognize in this film about Felice Schragenheim and Lilly Wust story. And the first thing that I would like to say is that we owe the fact that we're even thinking about a queer history of the Holocaust to feminist Jewish historians, so John Ringelheim, Marion Kaplan, Atina Grossman, and others. And because of their work, we understand much better how gender shaped certain aspects of the Holocaust. And women, as testimony shows, suffered both as Jews and as women. And in the case of what we see in this film, gender also created differences in the persecution of homosexual men and women in Nazi Germany, as Thomas, you were saying. So male homosexuality was criminalized under paragraph 175 of the German Penal Code. And this law preceded the Nazis, but it was made harsher in 1935. And as Jordana said, continued to be enforced until the late 60s and was in the books until 1991, I believe, or the early 90s. By contrast, female homosexuality was left unpunished, except in Austria and the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, where it was criminalized under paragraph 129. And whether female homosexuality should be criminalized or not was debated at different points in time, also before the Nazis. And these concerns about reproduction that you mentioned actually sort of drove the discussion oftentimes. So the fact that legal thinkers at the time didn't believe that female homosexuality posed a threat to the biopolitics of the nation sort of allow this to be left unpunished. Despite the fact that female same-sex love was not illegal during the Third Reich, lesbians were still persecuted due to their quote-unquote social behavior, and mostly because they were thought to fail to fulfill their roles as mothers and wives. So they were lumped together with prostitutes and other sort of antisocial elements, sort of literally in German, the word is like people's pest, Volksschädlinge. Same-sex sexuality was not necessarily given as the reason for the arrest of queer women. So sometimes they allege anti-fascist sentiment or the fact that they were harboring Jews. But as historians Ingeborg Boxhammer and Laurie Marhofer have shown in their work, references to non-normative gender expression and sexuality were coded in the denunciations involving lesbians, Jewish or otherwise. So we still know little about how Jewish lesbian women experienced the Third Reich and the Holocaust. And there is not a lot of research on Jewish lesbian Holocaust survivors. A colleague of mine, Anna Haikoba, professor at the University of Warwick in the UK, has noted the explicit bias in collected evidence of homosexuality in concentration camps. And she's even sort of like done a survey of the testimonies of the Shoah Foundation and the fact that homosexuality is mentioned, but very frequently in relation to sort of homophobic remarks, even though, and the lack of attention to homosexuality has led to implicit, if probably involuntary homophobia. So in many testimonies, you find sort of comments about sort of queer sexuality in the camps. And one survivor, Margareta Glass-Larson, describes lesbians in Terezin, so where Felice Schragenheim was also imprisoned, with sympathy, while she says that these feelings could only occur in this sort of exceptional environment. And there are other survivors who say that you know, they saw this, they found it aberrant, and that they actually had never heard of sort of lesbian love before. So it's something that is observed, is noted, but then sort of swept under the rug as something that shouldn't be really talked about after the Holocaust. So the interesting intervention that this film made is that it brought to the mainstream the queer history of the Holocaust, and while it has its flaws, and we might get to that in a second, at least you know, made us have this conversation that we continue to have until now. So
yeah, well, thank you, Javier. That's very interesting. And you know, Jeremy, as a filmmaker, telling these stories, the sort of tension between the conflict between public and private, and personal and state, which are some of the themes you explore so nicely, so well in your short film, are very much at play in Aimée Jaguar. And so in terms of constructing a narrative and telling this story, I just wanted to have some of your reactions as a filmmaker.
Thank you. Yeah, it's interesting because this film, I think something it does well is highlight the stark differences between those identities of the Jewish experience and the queer experience. Obviously, there being a difference between male and female queer experiences, but there's kind of a not so much of a blend like one might imagine. You see Felice's experience and you see Lilly's experience, and they're very different. And so I think on the one hand, we, you know, like both of you have, Jordana and Javier have already alluded to, there are some issues with this film in the sense that we don't really actually see much of the Jewish experience. And even the idea that Felice is underground and living as a hidden Jew in Germany at the time is not quite explored, and not quite explored in detail, or in maybe what we might consider a more realistic way that she might have to hide. But also the film is taken from the perspective of Lilly, her being both the one of the two that survives the Holocaust, and her probably being an influence in the writing of the book, and then maybe the making of the film. We know that it's from her perspective. So we get a lot of of her story as somebody who we know is anti-Semitic from the beginning, right? We see in the movie that she says she can smell Jews. So whether that's just something she learned socially or is totally ignorant of, who knows? But it's obviously there. And so learning about the lesbian experience during the Holocaust and the Jewish experience during the Holocaust is not quite explored because it's more a love story. And even the subtitle of the film, I think, is Love Over Death or something like that. And so it's really about the love story, and it's kind of a queer film in that sense, where them having their relationship is symbolic of freedom, and their queerness is liberation. And so we get a lot of, we see, Felice is all about now and living in the moment. And, she actually has to choose between fleeing and freedom and, being with her lover. And the same with, her Judaism, when she's hiding with Ilsa's family and they find out she's lesbian, she's kind of forced out of that home as well. So it's interesting the way that the freedom is pitted against her queerness and her Judaism in a way. So they're not really blended in that sense.
And conflict always makes good cinema. So that's
exactly
that's part of it. But what I found interesting is this notion of the person in hiding and their ability to pass. And first, I want to demonstrate my own ignorance, because although I've been very aware of the notion that for Jewish men, there was great danger in that even if they had false papers, all a Nazi or policeman or official would have to do is to ask them to pull down their pants, because if they were, it could be seen that they were circumcised, their lives were at risk. Clearly, it had never crossed my mind that women did not have this same handicap. And so the ability of women to pass as not Jewish, very much like this question of ability of people to pass as not gay, is sort of held up in this movie. Your comment that in the movie they say that Lily says she supposedly can smell Jews, and this comment later in the movie where they say, "Oh, Felice has dyed her hair blonde," as if that would make someone automatically not seem Jewish. I thought that those were interesting sort of twinned themes. Jordana, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's interesting. So statistically, Jewish women were more likely to survive in hiding or with false papers, and Jewish men were more likely to survive the concentration camps. And it's mostly the statistic with the hiding with false papers because there was a very easy way for Jewish men to be identified. I mean, there's even stories of men trying to uncircumcise themselves in order to continue to pass or to not have that.
My father did. My father had an operation.
Yeah. My grandfather's younger brother, they did as well. So it's really, and I think what this film does well is really highlight this underground society and this resistance movement that existed in Germany. Because I do think a lot of people consider in Nazi Germany for everyone to have been a Nazi perhaps, or for there to have been no resistance in Germany. And then on the other side, the fact that the Nazis really did want to make Germany Judenfrei, free of Jews, and that was their main intention. And in fact, the only real German Jews who remained in Germany in 1943 were either married to non-Jews or in the underground, or living with false identity papers. But to live with false identity papers, and I think the movie does show this, every day was living in constant fear, because it wasn't just ensuring that their papers held up under scrutiny because there were routine paper checks. It was also ration cards. It was also getting food, getting shelter, where would they live, ensuring that people who recognize them, and we even see this in the beginning of the film when they're fleeing from the opera or from the concert hall, a man stops her and checks her jacket and then says, like, your father was a good doctor. So the constant crippling fear and anxiety that people had every single day to ensure themselves safety. So it wasn't as simple as just getting like one fake ID and being on their merry way. And I think the movie does do a good job of sort of showing that constant fear, that constant need. Even I think the storyline about her friend, who's I believe also a Jewish lesbian, who says that she smells because she hasn't been able to shower.
Right.
And so these are like the little things that people had to be very conscious of.
Javier, I just wanted to go back to you for a second and ask about, in the movie, we sort of see this polyamorous isn't the exact right word, but the sort of group of women who sort of trade partners so freely among themselves. And then later in the movie, we have Felice and Lilly sort of getting, and I wondered what was the normative behavior during that period. So, if we look at it in the United States in the 70s and 80s, sort of what gay culture was like versus current, after marriage equality, et cetera. Is there a correlative?
I think that it's probably hard to tell. I mean, it's true that the movie shows a group of very uninhibited young women who have, polyamorous or non-possessive relationships with each other. We also see that Lilly is not that way at all, and the fact that she sort of thinks of love in a much more platonic way, especially after Felice's death, shows that people were different, and even love meant different things for different people. What the film maybe gets at, without really dwelling into it, is the fact that the Nazis, despite what people may have thought about sort of sexual repression, in the case here of homosexuality, sort of encouraged sexuality, heterosexual sexuality, and especially among those who were deemed sort of racially superior, so among Aryans. So you mentioned before Lebensborn and all that. The fact that the Nazis sort of actively encouraged heterosexual behavior, it's important here, and this is something that the post-war society had to grapple with in terms of these repressive, moralistic environment of the post-war German generation as a kind of reaction against these sort of hypersexuality more than anything else. Yeah, I think that the book does show how this group of women were, adopters of free love, but I don't know how much this is sort of romanticized in this case. I wanted to say maybe a couple of things about the passing point that you made, and also sort of based on Jordana's comments that show very well how important the history of gender is for the history of the Holocaust. And in the case here in the film, we also see how, well, we don't see that, but we know that Jewish men were the first to emigrate, women stay behind, elderly women tended to stay. And we see here Felice's grandmother who stays in Berlin until she is brought to the camp. And so we see how this plays an important role. We also see sort of the absurdity of Nazi racial thought and racial laws and its lethality at the same time. So all these stereotypes that people have interiorized, so Lilly as well. And passing, it's important in the film, but we need to think that the story, the history of passing is much older than the Third Reich and the history of intermarriage and assimilation. So people like Felice were pretty keenly aware of how you could navigate this society. And I'm gonna drop a book. This is what we academics do. We like to, call out on each other. I have a colleague of mine, Kerry Wallach, has written a book, Passing Illusions, and it's about passing in the Jewish visibility in Weimar Germany. And he gets us some of these points, how German Jews and German Jewish women in particular have been practicing how to pass for a long time already. But you were going to ask something else, Tom. Sorry.
No, that's okay. That's perfectly fine. I just thought about the way these characters are portrayed, because to some extent, neither Lily nor Felice are sort of completely likable characters. And I think all of us who grew up on Hollywood movies are used to our heroes being all good and our villains being all bad. And Lily is at times seems less intelligent or vain or only seeking, whoever affection she can get. Our first introduction to her is as an adulteress, and similarly, Felice is constantly presented as sort of someone who only cares about herself and her own pleasure. Now, I think there's an argument we can make that the stress that Jordana spoke about, not only the stress of being in hiding, but just the stress of the war that Lily is under also makes them sort of into these live for today now kind of personalities, grasping at whatever pleasure they can find wherever they can find it. But in terms of filmmaking and narrative, I think it's quite interesting that we have these stories with these characters who are, one could say nuanced, but I could also say quite flawed. Jeremy, why don't you respond to that?
Yeah, it's interesting that you mention Lily as naive and innocent and kind of unlikable in that sense, because I think making her naive in that way makes her actually a little more likable. Otherwise, she is a Nazi sympathizer who is, cheating on her husband. And in order to make her more likable, we see that she maybe doesn't understand what she's doing. And so on the one hand, it allows us to kind of be with her character and her story. On the other hand, in terms of the film as its context, we're kind of erasing that association with Nazi mentality, and also kind of blurring the lines between what Felice is experiencing as somebody who is Jewish and ends up being murdered by the Nazis, versus Lily, who she might be struggling, but it's not the same kind of struggle. So I saw that as a way to actually identify with Lily, that she's naive and we're kind of feeling for her in that sense. And the other thing you mentioned about it starting with her, well, it actually starts with her as an adult or as an elderly woman.
Right.
And because it's through her perspective, through flashbacks, and actually the first and last shot of the film is her behind a camera looking at Felice. So the filmmaker is telling you, like, this is from somebody else's perspective. And the story we have is obviously from Lily because Felice didn't survive. So both on the one hand, acknowledging that we are making her more likable, but also identifying that this is from her point of view, both as a real person and in the movie.
And what did all of you think about that moment in the film where Ilse says to Lily, "You visited her at Theresienstadt, that got her killed," and sort of brings that back at the end of the very end of the movie about whether she caused her death or not, and whether in some way maybe she wanted to keep anyone else from loving Felice in some strange way. Was her love that overpowering? Did any of you have a reaction to that moment in the film? Javier, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I can. I did. I think Lily is kind of frustrating, I must say here. I think that the book maybe does a better job showing the nuance of this person, of this woman, and the fact that she despite her good intention, she benefited from the power structures at the time, and that as a bearer of the motherhood, so the mother's cross of honor, she fared much better than those she sought to protect. So Felice and the woman afterwards, she felt entitled, and even when interacting with Nazi officials, we see in the book, and here she says, like, she talked to the official when she went to visit Felice, and she sort of didn't take it so seriously at the time. And what bothered me about Lilly in the film is that I think if we look at a sort of larger sort of historical meta-narrative framework, also in the 1990s, is that she stands for this argument that the German women were innocent and they did not carry any responsibility for what happened during the Third Reich and the Holocaust. But in a way, Ilse at the end of the movie sort of reminds us that she did personally carry responsibility for what happened. So in a way, the film is ambiguous around that, but it bothered me that when Felice is arrested, the camera focuses on Lilly's suffering, on Lilly's pain, at the moment in which Felice has already been completely dehumanized when she is carried down the stairs. And we see Lilly screaming, and there is the key light, and it's very dramatic. And that sort of bothered me. I don't know how Jeremy or Jordana felt.
I think that's exactly right. And I think all of you have brought out that this movie in many ways is Lilly's story. And just like Schindler's List was Schindler's story more than it was the story of the Ben Kingsley character, there is this notion of the non-Jewish intermediary for people to be able to, feel comfortable with the story. But I want to share with you and get your reaction that I watched the film again last night, and when I was watching it, I had this terrible thought, which was that if we look at how Felice is characterized in the movie as this corrupter, as this person who takes a married, mother of four and makes her into a lesbian, and with no care about her country, her friends, if you were to write sort of an anti-Semitic portrayal of what it is the Jew does in society from their Stürmer, it wouldn't be so different. Many of the characteristics Felice demonstrates in this movie, in which she's the dark one in every way. So I was kind of like a strange thought, but in some ways, maybe this film being Lilly's story does, in a weird way, put forward and perpetuate some of these anti-Semitic tropes. Jordana.
It's so interesting that you said that, because my partner said the same thing when we watched the movie last night about how maybe the movie was portraying the Jewish woman as the corruptor. And I do see it, but I do think it's from Lilly's perspective, and it's in a way like a coming out story for her, because she goes and sort of realizes that she's truly, and if you read her writing about her relationship, you can tell she really truly loved Felice. Like she talks about how she found herself in that relationship. So I wonder though if it was like a filmmaking choice. And it's funny because that statement about her going to Theresienstadt is what got Felice sent to Auschwitz kind of did bother me, because if you know the actual history, Lilly actually went and visited Felice at the headquarters where she was kept before she was sent to Theresienstadt, because she was tortured beforehand. And that reminded me more of the Rosenstrasse protest, where you have a group of non-Jewish Aryan German women who go and protest the arrestation of their Jewish spouses. And this is the only time there was an open protest in all of Nazi Germany. And that to me actually recalled this moment in which the Rosenstrasse protests really does exemplify the great extent that non-Jewish spouses would go in order to protect the people that they loved from being deported. And I think that really is what her visiting Felicia, even after she's arrested, is. And I wondered if the film's choice and how they portrayed that was really because maybe Lilly carried such a burden of survivor's guilt her entire life. And maybe that was like she blamed
look,
herself.
I mean, what we know from of Nazi history is that it's not Lilly showing up at Theresienstadt that gets you deported to the camps, right? Like, it's they were deporting you, at their whim, regardless. So she might have lived another day or another week, but the outcome would have been, as we saw in last week's Jacob the Liar, the outcome's the same. But
Tom, what I would say
Yeah.
about this is that, well, you are right that she is not responsible for her death directly. What that shows is how oblivious she is about her privilege in this
Yeah.
situation.
yes,
I think,
I think that's the point.
it's
well taken.
interesting that Jordana mentioned Rosenstrasse. There is also a film about that, and it's with Maria Schrader as well.
That's my last question before we open this up to questions, which is that, and by the way, anyone listening in, if you have a question, please put it in the Q&A and we'll try and get to as many of them as we can. But when I was doing a little bit of research, I discovered there's not really a lot of films, documentary, or even narrative about persecution of homosexuals, of queer life during the Nazi era. There's the play turned movie Bent. There's the article or 175. But so I'm going to ask you if there's other works that you know about that we should watch that are worth noting, or better yet, why are there not more movies about this subject? And Jeremy, are you going to make one?
Yeah, I'm making one right now, so look out for it. It's called Unspoken. But no, there was a TV movie that was made that I actually can't remember if it was French or German, but it did portray a Jewish woman who moves in with a friend and discovers that he's gay, and so he's helping hide her. And so we learn a little bit about both of their experiences side by side. But that was called A Love to Hide. I don't know what the original name of it was. But there really aren't too many movies depicting it. Bent, I think, was so huge at the time because it was such a taboo. I mean, like we said,
and it had Richard Gere in the play.
But like we said, the actual paragraph 175 was still in effect after World War II. So there were gay men that were liberated from concentration camps and then sent back to jail. So, just the topic alone couldn't be discussed for years. And the fact that Bent came out and had such an impact showed that people weren't willing to talk about it beforehand, and even still it was a taboo. So the fact that it wasn't part of the conversation, that there weren't so many testimonies about it, and then it took even longer to then turn that into film is a huge part of that.
Jordana or Javier, you want to add anything or on this subject? So
I think you're right. I mean, there's been scholarship and some literature about this. I think Gatbeck's An Underground Life. So it's also a memoir about sort of being gay and as a submarine in Berlin at the time. But there is really not been a lot of filmic representation. There is a graphic novel that came out in France a couple of years ago, so The Pink Triangle, and it was translated into German. I don't think it's translated into English yet. So we're starting to get there, but not a lot. And I think what we're still missing is more of sort of the Jewish queer experience. And so I'm excited that Jeremy is working on that right now.
Yeah. So among the questions, one which we've sort of touched upon was how did Lilly's visit cause or help cause Felice's death? Basically, um, the attention, singling someone out would probably have been enough to get someone marked as an enemy of the state. But Jordana, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I honestly don't think in reality her visit would have sent someone to Auschwitz. And also, I believe from scholarly research, it's believed that Felice actually died on a death march. So it's not as if she was taken out and shot directly. I really did understand that, and I'm not in the film business, but I understood that to really be representative of the guilt that Lilly carried her entire life. Whether if she blamed herself for keeping Felice in Germany when she had an opportunity to leave, or whatever other survivor guilt she had, that's how I understood it to be from her perspective of just this crushing guilt.
Yep. So someone is asking, do we know if any of the cast and film are still currently, as I mentioned, Maria Schrader, who plays Felice, is one of the top writer directors in the world, but in Germany. And Ilse is the actress who played Ilse, who's has been in many movies. I mean, they're all quite successful and popular. The director, this was his first film, and he's made a couple more, but he's not been as prolific as one might expect after this movie. But perhaps that's because it's a hard act to follow if this is your first movie. One of the other questions that I wanted to get to, someone asked about, there's a shot of the horses on the, I believe it's the Brandenburg Gate, and that they thought that in the beginning of the movie it stands in for the sort of apocalypse coming, but that at the end of the movie maybe it represents the four friends who were once together, and they wanted to know if any of you thought of that when you watched the film. Jeremy, you want to start us off?
Sure. I didn't think of it. It's a really nice metaphor. I think because I saw the film more as a love story than about the friend group, it didn't occur to me, but I do like the thought.
And Javier, anything? Nope.
I think for me, sort of what it reminded me, that shot or all the scenes of the bombing is the important role that they play in sort of memoirs of the time, but also sort of debate in the 1990s about sort of the German suffering and bombings and so on. So that the movie is sort of reflecting on that. By the way, Maria Schrader has been doing a lot of work too. She recently, I think, made a film about Stefan so
yes,
the memoirs of Farewell to Europe. So she's been
she's at the top of the game. So you know what? I think that about concludes our conversation. But I want to give you each the opportunity to give us some final words on the movie. I will call you Jeremy, then Javier, then Jordana. I'll give Jordana the final word. Jeremy, any final thoughts on the movie?
Yeah, I mean, I think this conversation was really important because when it comes to films in general, but especially Holocaust films, obviously context is huge. And so I think for a lot of people who might have seen this film, you don't necessarily have these conversations before or afterwards about what's missing or what influenced it. And so I think it's really amazing that this series is happening at the Museum of the Holocaust, because it's important to not only watch these films and learn about these stories, but to get the perspective behind it. Because filmmaking is, you're taking a story and you're making it cinematic and dramatic, and that's not always factual.
Yeah. Javier?
Yeah, and to follow up on Jeremy, I think the film is also about ourselves, our time. So we are telling our stories through that as well. What I would like to say, like, final words, is going back to something that Jordana said right at the beginning when she mentioned intersectionality. I think that this is something very important, very useful to understand this film. A film that's about female economic emancipation, the rejection of heteropatriarchy at the end, through divorce, and through sort of female emancipation, and this sort of opposition to Nazi racist laws, even if subtly is happening there. I think if we look at it intersectionality, so paying attention to the markers of identity of all of these women, adds complexity to their story and their life experiences and their choices. And it also compels us to maybe to situate any critical or ambivalent perspective we may have towards Lilly Wust. And I seem to be the one who is more ambivalent about her. I really like that Jordana said that she understood this more as a story of guilt than as a story of somebody who's been sort of repressing her role as an oppressor. But I think if we think about the choices that she was able to make, and also those who she couldn't make because of her position in society, we can be more nuanced and less critical about her choices, not as something that's moral, immoral and or unethical in a way.
And Jordana.
Yeah, I would say, although I don't think this is like an intro to the Holocaust film for people who don't know that much about the Holocaust, I do think what's really important at the core of this film is that it's a story of like human capacity, and how when we get to know other people and begin to empathize with them, it changes who we are fundamentally. For Lilly to go from being a Nazi officer's wife, mother of 4 children, someone who could smell Jews, to somebody who ultimately rescues 3 Jewish lives because of the profound change she goes through by loving someone that she might not have known, who's a little bit maybe different than she is. I think that that is really at the heart of this story, is understanding how we can, do better in our own communities, be a better version of ourselves, transform, and maybe transform others. And that's what I really think is the core of this, is it's not just a story about love, but it's also a story about how we can be better versions of ourselves.
Well, that's a beautiful note on which to end this panel discussion. I want to thank all of you for participating. I want to thank all of you who are watching. I want to remind you that next Thursday, we'll be discussing our last film in the series, Naked Among Wolves, which is also based on a true story and was shot on location in Buchenwald. With that, I wish you all guten Abend, and thank you for your participation. Good night.